Well, one of the things that struck me during the 2 years that I spent in Pakistan was the way in which not only are the borders porous, and not only does the border that separates Pakistan and Afghanistan really mean very little to the people that are living on either side of it, but increasingly, what really was grabbing my attention was the way in which this ideological battle was being overtaken by criminal elements, and the way that the Taliban had come to represent sort of an amalgamation of gangs up and down the border. And so this is increasingly grabbed my attention. Last December, I spent a month in North Africa looking at the way in which Al Qaeda's operations there have become increasingly criminalized or absorbed by criminal elements, the kidnapping, the banditry, etc. The questions about rolling back globalization and that the aftermath of the economic crisis would cause countries to become solely concerned with consolidating their sort of national interest, I think is a little bit overblown. I think what's increasingly important though too is to see the way in which making a buck really has absorbed a lot of the political elements. Now, whether I'm becoming a Marxist in my old age or something along those lines, I think that the aftermath of the economic crisis has surprised me in many ways, and this is just one of them. I think that the way in which financial markets are connected, and yet by the same token, the way in which certain countries have remained isolated, it's fascinating to look at how certain aspects of sort of global capitalism have permeated areas that seem untouched by it. I mean, if we look at a case in point of the Niger Delta, you have a couple of different fascinating ways in which the economic crisis has hit there. On the one hand, Nigeria has tried to present itself as a regional power, and therefore was borrowing heavily on credit over the past several years. Therefore, the credit crunch hurt it in many ways. On the other hand, though, because of the significant and profound oil wealth that the country has, it's been able to weather the storm better than a country that was, say, just betting on regional hegemony solely for the sake of regional hegemony and didn't have the oil wealth. What else you've seen in the Niger Delta that's fascinating is the way in which the capitalism in its most base and in sometimes kind of ruthless and crude sense, and that is the literally stealing and selling back of humans, has become widespread, and that is the kidnapping trade. And the kidnapping trade has now become sort of a shadow economy throughout the Niger Delta and increasingly throughout all of Nigeria. Last November, I was listening to an NPR clip as I was driving around D.C., and they mentioned that the new president of the Maldives, who was to be inaugurated the next day, had, on the eve of his inauguration, announced that he was planning to buy a new country. And I'm sitting there listening to this NPR bit, and I thought, oh, there's a great backstory to this. So when I looked into it a bit more, the Maldives is the highest point in the Maldives is about 8.5 feet above sea level. And if scientific projections, if the conventional scientific projections are correct, by the end of the century, half of the Maldives could go underwater. So this president has, it was partially a PR stunt, and he knew this going in. And he knew that if he was to announce that he was buying a new country, a bunch of journalists from the New York Times Magazine and elsewhere would descend on the Maldives and say, who is this crazy guy? But in the process, the Maldives probably have gotten more mainstream media attention in the past 9 months because of this than they have, in the past 30 years during the regime of the old president. So, and it turned out to be a fascinating story. When you looked at the science a little bit closer, and when I started talking to scientists, you see all these other fascinating side and second stories. I mean, the global warming issue is one thing, the rising sea levels is another thing, but then you kind of look at the intricacies of this. And in the intricacies in the Maldives is that as the seas rise, they're actually grabbing parts of the coral and spreading them across the island, thus raising the islands at the same time. So, it certainly is not quite as simple as I originally thought when I arrived there. Well, I think that the story in Pakistan has changed. There was a real significant turning point in late April when the Taliban moved out of their stronghold in the Swat Valley and began advancing towards the capital. For the first time in the past 8-9 years, you saw the idea of the Taliban, which many Pakistanis have always been infatuated with. They've always looked at the Taliban as an abstraction, as these righteous, perhaps slightly misguided bumpkins, but nonetheless were still, doing what Islam was calling for. and yet you had this fear of the Taliban as like the real guys. No resident, no middle class resident of Lahore wants the Taliban to be patrolling their streets. And yet you talk to them and they'd say, "Oh, the Taliban are such great people." So, in late April, when the Taliban began advancing close to Islamabad, the idea and the abstraction suddenly collapsed, and all of a sudden, and that really triggered a sea change in public opinion, and it has allowed the army, the Pakistani army, to be able to launch a fairly sustained counterinsurgency against the Taliban. And I think it will be looked at as being a pretty critical turning point in the way that the army and the state moves against the militants in the coming years. Well, I think that it's always amazing the way that the abstraction of America and the way the reality of America are sort of fall into one, and are separate up until the time that someone meets an American. I mean, I was in the Swat Valley one time, and I'm writing there as a New York Times correspondent, and I've got all these militants coming up to me, with floppy hats and rocket launchers, asking me which newspaper I work for in English, and I'm telling them that I work for the New York Times, and they're saying, "Well, I used to live in Louisiana and Texas," this one guy said, "serving barbecue at barbecue joints." So you see this idea of the United States is abhorred in many parts of the developing world. But individual Americans, they're always so surprised, particularly when you're a reporter and particularly when you're out in the communities. Because unfortunately, in the case of Pakistan, in the case of Bangladesh, their interaction with Americans is so limited. And what they see of America are diplomats moving through the city with these huge convoys. So when they kind of finally have the chance to meet an American, they say, "Well, you guys aren't as bad as everyone thinks." It was a pretty amazing experience, too, in December, when I was the first and only time that I was in Africa up until now. And it was right after Obama's election, and it was great to be in Africa then, and to be able to sort of again proudly present yourself in the Muslim world as an American, and to see people's reaction. And there was something after that night. I thought, the night of the election, and I knew I was going to Mauritania in 3 weeks. And I thought, this is going to be fun. This is going to be good to be able to once again introduce yourself and know that someone's not going to kind of immediately have cast a negative impression of you.